Right now, more than 8 billion Homo sapiens walk this planet. We're everywhere. Cities, villages, mountains, deserts, you name it. But here's something most people don't realize. There was a moment in our history when we almost didn't make it, when modern humans came so close to vanishing that only a few thousand of us were left, a tiny group standing on the edge of complete extinction. If things had gone just a bit worse back then, you and I wouldn't be here right now. Quick thing, subscribe if you want more of these. And hey, where are you listening from? What time is it there? Someone from Amsterdam told me they listen at 4 a.m, and I'm wondering if that's before bed or just really early morning. So let's go back, way back. Around 300,000 years ago, somewhere in the vast landscapes of Africa, a new kind of human showed up. This was Homo sapiens, the wise human, that's what the name means, and compared to the other human species that came before, like Homo erectus or Homo habilis, we had something different going on, something special. Our brains were more advanced, we had higher foreheads, faces that were more refined, less brutish, but the real game changer was inside that skull. We could think abstractly, we could imagine things that didn't exist yet, we could plan for tomorrow, next week, next season. That ability, that one difference, eventually put modern humans on the path to dominating this entire planet. But at first, Homo sapiens weren't much to look at, just small bands of people wandering around the African savannas and jungles. They survived by hunting and gathering, completely at the mercy of nature. The men would go out hunting antelopes, giraffes, sometimes even baby elephants if they got lucky. Meanwhile, women and children gathered fruits, dug up roots from the ground, collected wild seeds wherever they could find them. These early humans knew how to use fire. They could craft tools from stone and bone. Simple stuff, but it gave them a crucial edge in what was honestly a brutal existence. Around 200,000 to 100,000 years ago, the first groups of Homo sapiens started leaving Africa. They crossed deserts, they followed coastlines. Slowly but surely, they spread into the Middle East and then later into Asia. On that journey, they ran into their relatives, other human species, Neanderthals living in Europe and West Asia, Denisovans up in Siberia. For thousands of years, these different human species existed at the same time. Sometimes they competed for resources, sometimes they got along and even mixed together. DNA evidence today proves this. Inside each of us, buried in our genes, there's a little bit of Neanderthal DNA. Some of us have Denisovan genes too, remnants from those ancient relationships. Our ancestors literally interbred with other human species. Life for Homo sapiens back then was incredibly hard. There was no agriculture, no cities, no written language. Everything centered around one goal: survival. Finding enough food, finding shelter, staying away from predators that wanted to eat you. Small groups, usually only a few dozen people, moved constantly with the changing seasons. They relied on memory and natural signs to navigate. Which way did the herds go last year? Where did we find water before? That kind of knowledge kept them alive. Language back then was still pretty primitive. Sounds, gestures, symbols, they used these to coordinate hunts or warn each other about danger, but even this basic communication was a massive advantage over most other species on Earth. In Africa and other places, the climate stayed relatively stable for tens of thousands of years. This allowed Homo sapiens to thrive and spread. They adapted to so many different environments. Dense jungles, dry savannas, coastal areas rich with fish. From Africa, they gradually spread across the entire Eurasian continent, setting themselves up for an eventual journey to conquer the whole world. Homo sapiens seemed to be entering their first golden age. Sure, they were still a small species, but they were brimming with potential. The future looked promising. What they didn't know was that Earth itself was about to throw the harshest survival test imaginable at them. Around 74,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens had scattered into small groups all across the planet, something catastrophic happened. A devastating natural disaster struck without warning. On the island of Sumatra, a supervolcano named Toba erupted. And when I say erupted, I mean it released thousands of cubic miles of lava and ash into the atmosphere. This wasn't some normal volcanic eruption. This was one of the most powerful explosions in Earth's entire history. Ash from Toba spread across huge parts of Asia. It covered the skies. It blocked out sunlight. Global temperatures dropped sharply. Plants started dying in massive numbers. Food chains collapsed. Both humans and animals faced a volcanic winter that would last for years, possibly even decades. And in that nightmare scenario, Homo sapiens, this species that had seemed so promising, suddenly became more fragile than anyone could have imagined. Before this disaster, Homo sapiens were doing okay, full of potential, sure, but not yet secure, not yet strong. They were still in the early stages of evolution. There weren't enough of them to be everywhere. They weren't powerful enough to control nature. Then this terrifying event happened. The eruption of the Toba supervolcano, located on what's now the island of Sumatra in modern-day Indonesia. An event that nearly erased all modern humans from existence. Think about what a volcano is for a second. You probably picture glowing red lava flowing from a crater, ash clouds covering the sky. That's a normal volcano, but Toba was not normal. Toba was a supervolcano, a completely different category of destruction, the kind of volcano with destructive power that's thousands of times greater than even the biggest volcanoes erupting today. When Toba blew, it spewed out somewhere between 2,800 and 3,000 cubic miles of lava and ash. The volume is almost impossible to wrap your head around. To put it in perspective, this eruption was 5,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens in the United States back in 1980. It made the Krakatoa disaster of 1883, which people recorded as one of the most cataclysmic events ever, look like nothing. The explosion's power completely destroyed everything around it. Layers of ash, several yards thick, blanketed all of Southeast Asia. Pyroclastic flows, which are basically superheated gas mixed with lava, rushed down the mountainside at speeds of hundreds of miles per hour. They incinerated every single living thing in their path. Lakes turned into fire. Rivers boiled. The jungles around Sumatra became a sea of flames in moments. But the impact didn't stop there. It went global. Billions of tons of ash and sulfur gases got thrust up into the stratosphere and then spread across the entire planet. The atmosphere became murky, thick with particles. Sunlight couldn't get through anymore, leading to what scientists call a volcanic winter. Global temperatures suddenly dropped by 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. In some places, it was even worse. The freezing winters didn't last just a few years. They dragged on possibly for decades. For ecosystems everywhere, this was essentially a death sentence. Plants couldn't photosynthesize without sunlight. Vegetation died off on a massive scale. Herbivores lost their food sources, which triggered the collapse of the entire food chain, tier by tier. Many large animals simply disappeared from vast regions of Asia and Africa. For Homo sapiens, who survived by hunting and gathering, this was the ultimate survival catastrophe. Their entire way of life depended on nature providing food, and suddenly nature stopped providing. Imagine what happened next. Before Toba, there were hundreds of thousands of Homo sapiens scattered across Africa and Asia. After the supervolcano erupted, that population plummeted dramatically. Small groups of people were completely wiped out. Communities that had been thriving suddenly dwindled to just a handful of survivors. This moment in history is what scientists call the genetic bottleneck. It's a concept in evolutionary biology that describes when a population size drops so drastically that there's a major loss of genetic diversity, and we have evidence for this bottleneck. The evidence comes from our own DNA today. When scientists decoded the human genome and started really studying our genetic makeup, they discovered something strange. The genetic diversity of Homo sapiens is unusually low. Compared to chimpanzees or gorillas, who are our closest living relatives, the genetic difference between any two humans on Earth today is far smaller than the difference between two individual chimps or gorillas. Think about that. Two random chimpanzees are more genetically different from each other than you are from someone living on the other side of the planet. How does that happen? There's only one explanation that makes sense. Our ancestors must have gone through a period where there were extremely low numbers of us, so few that the shared gene pool shrank severely. According to many estimates from geneticists, the global population of Homo sapiens during this bottleneck may have dropped to only 2,000 to 10,000 individuals. That's it, 2,000 to 10,000 people on the entire planet. That number is equivalent to a small town today. If you gathered all our surviving ancestors from that time period and put them in one place, they'd barely fill a soccer stadium. The fragility of that moment is almost unbelievable. A single epidemic could have erased us. One bad drought, another natural disaster, any of these things could have easily wiped out the entire human species forever. We were that close to extinction. So what happens when you have a genetic bottleneck like this? What are the consequences? When there are too few individuals in a species, many rare genetic variants just disappear forever. They're gone. The gene pool becomes impoverished, which makes the species way more vulnerable to diseases and environmental changes. This decline actually left its mark that we can still see today. Some scientists believe that common genetic diseases in modern humans, things like haemophilia or various immune disorders, might trace all the way back to that harsh period. Back when dominant and recessive genes got concentrated within this tiny surviving community. But here's the weird paradox. The genetic bottleneck actually contributed to the unity of Homo sapiens. When only a few thousand people survived, they all shared the same basic genetic foundation. This explains why humans around the entire world, from Africa to Europe to Asia to the Americas, all share such remarkably similar DNA. Scientifically speaking, any two people on this planet might differ in language, culture, skin color, all the surface stuff, but genetically, we're far closer to each other than individuals in many other animal species are to each other. We're all incredibly similar at the DNA level because we all descend from that tiny group that survived. Many anthropologists argue that this bottleneck stage became the ultimate survival test. Only the groups that were most adaptable, most cooperative, most creative could endure what came next. Small groups that learned to exploit coastal seafood, craft better tools, organize more efficient hunts. These became the nucleus for the eventual revival of Homo sapiens. Intelligence and cooperation became the weapons that helped humanity pass through this narrow gate between life and death, and somehow, astonishingly, from just a few thousand individuals, Homo sapiens didn't just survive. We recovered, we grew, and eventually we spread across the entire planet. So how did they manage to pass such a brutal test? While many animal species vanished completely, and even other human species like Homo erectus or Homo floresiensis gradually went extinct, Homo sapiens somehow came back stronger. What was the secret? First and foremost, it came down to community cooperation. At the absolute darkest moment, Homo sapiens understood something critical. Individual survival mattered way less than the survival of the group. You couldn't make it alone, nobody could. Small communities, usually around 20 to 50 people, divided up roles. Men hunted, women gathered, elders took care of the children and passed down knowledge. Young adults protected everyone from predators. Without this cooperation, individuals on their own would have died quickly from hunger, disease, or attacks. Archaeological evidence shows something fascinating. Even as early as 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens already showed signs of burying their dead and caring for sick members of the group. This proves they cared for each other in ways that other human species didn't. It was compassion and social bonding that turned them into resilient groups capable of enduring the worst times imaginable. In a harsh world where everything wanted to kill you, intelligence became the strongest weapon available. Homo sapiens crafted stone tools that were far more sophisticated than what earlier human species had made. Spear tips with sharp stone points, blades made from quartz or obsidian, which is basically volcanic glass. These tools allowed them to hunt large prey, deer, wild horses, even young mammoths when the opportunity came up. But more importantly than the tools themselves, they mastered fire, and fire changed everything. With fire, they could cook food, which killed bacteria and made it way easier to digest. They absorbed more energy from the same amount of food. This extra energy fueled their large brains, which needed a ton of calories to function properly. More energy meant more brain development. More brain development meant better survival strategies. Fire was also a shield against the darkness, a defense against predators that feared the flames, a source of warmth during the freezing volcanic winters that followed Toba. You could argue that fire transformed Homo sapiens into true humans, setting us completely apart from all other primates. While ecosystems on land were collapsing everywhere, many groups of Homo sapiens did something smart. They headed for the coasts. Archaeological studies at places like Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point in South Africa show that around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, humans were already exploiting marine resources heavily. They ate fish, clams, snails, seaweed. This was a rich, nutritious food source that was abundant and way less affected by the global climate changes happening inland. The plants might be dying on land, but the ocean still had food. These coastal areas became oases, the final refuges where a few thousand Homo sapiens managed to endure the volcanic winter. From those small seaside communities, the human population started to gradually recover. The DNA of many people today carries traces that indicate our ancestors came from groups that survived in East Africa, South Africa, and along the Indian Ocean coasts. Those coastal refuges saved us. Another crucial factor was early language. Sure, it wasn't as complex as the languages we speak today, but humans back then could already produce systems of sounds, symbols, and gestures to coordinate with each other. They could plan hunts together, they could warn each other about danger, they could share knowledge. When one group discovered a better way to make tools, they could pass that information to another group. When a hunting ground ran out of animals, they could tell others to search somewhere else. This was a capability that Neanderthals, despite being strong and intelligent, might not have developed to the same level. Thanks to language, Homo sapiens didn't just survive individually, they passed down experiences across generations. Each new generation started with more knowledge than the one before. They built on what came before instead of starting from scratch every time. This accumulation of knowledge gave Homo sapiens a massive advantage. Homo sapiens were also the most versatile of all human species, the most adaptable. They could live pretty much anywhere. Jungles, grasslands, caves, along the coast. It didn't matter. When large animals disappeared, they didn't starve. They just switched to hunting smaller game like rabbits, birds, fish, whatever was available. When trees died during the cold climate, they didn't give up. They dug up underground tubers. They relied on stored nuts and dried fruits they'd saved earlier. This flexibility set them entirely apart from many other species that depended on just one food source. Think about it this way. If an animal species survived only by eating tall grasses, what happened when the grasslands vanished? That species went extinct. Simple as that, but Homo sapiens could pivot, find alternatives, keep adapting endlessly. That's what kept us alive. Thanks to all these factors working together, cooperation, advanced tools, mastery of fire, coastal seafood, language, and incredible adaptability, Homo sapiens managed to squeeze through history's narrowest gate. From just a few thousand individuals scattered along coastlines and hiding in caves, they gradually recovered their numbers. Then they expanded. Out of Africa once again, into the Middle East, across Asia, into Europe, and eventually across the entire globe. Along the way, Homo sapiens encountered other human species again. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, they met them, they interbred with them, and eventually they replaced them. Fragments of those species' DNA still remain inside us today. You can see it in genetic tests, but only Homo sapiens survived as a distinct species to this day. The Neanderthals are gone. The Denisovans are gone. We're the only ones left. Looking back at this whole story, the survival of Homo sapiens was never a sure thing. It wasn't inevitable. It was the result of intelligence, unity, and resilience when facing adversity. If our ancestors had been even slightly weaker, less creative, or unwilling to cooperate with each other, Homo sapiens might have vanished just like so many other species did. And if that had happened, you and I wouldn't be here today to talk about any of this. We wouldn't exist. Our entire civilization, everything humans have ever built or created, would never have happened. It all hinged on those few thousand people who refused to give up during the darkest period in human history. But there's more to this story. For decades, scientists believed the Toba catastrophe hypothesis and the genetic bottleneck were settled facts. The story seemed clear. Supervolcano erupts, climate goes haywire, humans almost go extinct, case closed. However, as science progressed and new evidence came to light, researchers started arguing about it. Fiercely, was the Toba event really that destructive, or have we maybe exaggerated its impact? Back in the 1990s, geneticists published their analyses of modern human DNA. They noticed our genetic diversity was unusually low, way lower than it should be for a species as widespread as we are. This suggested that at some point in the past, the human population must have dropped to only a few thousand individuals. This genetic evidence became the foundation for the Toba bottleneck hypothesis. According to this idea, the eruption 74,000 years ago triggered a volcanic winter that lasted for decades. Sunlight got blocked, the global climate cooled by 5 to 9 degrees. Plants died off in huge numbers, food chains collapsed everywhere. Homo sapiens, who were in the middle of expanding out of Africa when this happened, suddenly fell into a survival crisis. Many small groups got wiped out completely. Only a few thousand lucky survivors remained, huddled in those coastal refuges we talked about earlier. This dramatic scenario spread rapidly through the scientific community and then into mainstream media. It captured people's imaginations. The idea that all of humanity today descends from one tiny band of ancestors who barely made it through history's narrow gate. It's a powerful story. But then, starting in the early 21st century, a series of archaeological studies started raising doubts. Scientists excavated a site called Jwalapuram in southern India. This place was directly affected by Toba's ash fallout. The ash layer there is thick and obvious. What they discovered surprised them. Stone tools crafted by Homo sapiens appeared continuously in the layers before and after the catastrophe. There were no signs of interruption, no gap in human activity. This suggested that humans in that area survived the eruption without being completely wiped out. In Africa, coastal caves like Blombos Cave also showed evidence that Homo sapiens maintained their presence right through the time period when Toba erupted. Again, no clear proof that the human population crashed as dramatically as the few thousand survivors scenario suggested. Some climatologists started arguing that Toba's global impact might have been overstated. Yes, ash spread widely across huge areas, but maybe the atmosphere recovered more quickly than we initially assumed. Maybe temperatures dropped sharply in some regions, while other areas, especially coastal zones or places near the equator, retained relatively stable living conditions. This could explain why certain communities of Homo sapiens not only survived but actually continued to develop and thrive during this period. They weren't all huddled on the brink of extinction. Some groups were doing okay, even if we accept that humanity experienced a genetic bottleneck, which the DNA evidence strongly suggests we did. That doesn't necessarily mean Toba was the sole cause. Some scientists argue that something called the founder effect offers a better explanation. Here's how the founder effect works. When a small group of Homo sapiens left Africa to migrate into the wider world, they carried with them only a fraction of the species' total gene pool. Not everyone left Africa, just some groups, and those groups that migrated had limited genetic diversity to begin with. The global spread of this relatively small founding population could explain today's low human genetic diversity without requiring a worldwide near-extinction event. We could have low genetic diversity simply because the ancestors of most people alive today all came from a limited number of groups that left Africa. Throughout evolutionary history, Homo sapiens and other human species probably went through multiple population declines, climate shifts, disease outbreaks, conflicts with other groups. Toba was certainly one major event, but it might not have been the sole cause of the genetic bottleneck we see in our DNA. The truth, as it often does, probably lies somewhere in between these extreme positions. It's possible that Toba had a really strong impact in certain regions, wiping out many Homo sapiens groups in Asia and parts of Africa, but in coastal areas or regions that were less affected by the volcanic winter, humans managed to hold on. As a result, even though Homo sapiens weren't driven to the brink of total extinction, they still endured a significant population decline. The genetic traces of that decline remain within our bodies today. You can see it in our DNA. The bottleneck happened. The question is just how severe it really was. What we know for certain is this: Toba did not wipe out Homo sapiens. The archaeological evidence is clear on that point. Humans continued to create tools after the eruption. They painted on cave walls, they crafted jewelry from seashells and beads. These are symbolic behaviors that prove human intelligence and culture didn't fade after the disaster. If anything, the harsh adversity made Homo sapiens stronger, more united, more creative. The species that emerged from this crisis was tougher and more adaptable than before. Whether or not Toba truly brought Homo sapiens to the absolute brink of extinction, the story of the genetic bottleneck still carries enormous meaning for us today. It reminds us that human existence has always been incredibly fragile when faced with the raw power of nature, a supervolcano erupting, an asteroid striking Earth, massive climate change. Any of these could become life or death tests for our species. We've faced them before, we'll probably face them again. At the same time, the ongoing scientific debate shows us something important about how science actually works. Science isn't about finding one answer and sticking to it forever. It's constantly evolving. Each new piece of evidence that gets discovered, whether it's ancient DNA extracted from fossils or archaeological remains dug up from the ground, sheds more light on the puzzle of human evolution. The truth about our past may never be completely simple or straightforward, but the search for that truth is what makes the story of Homo sapiens so compelling. We're still learning about where we came from, still discovering new things about our ancestors, and every discovery changes our understanding a little bit. More than 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens came dangerously close to extinction after the Toba catastrophe. But here's the thing, even in modern times, right now, countless threats could push humanity into a new genetic bottleneck, or even wipe us out entirely. Earth still harbours dangers that are powerful enough to thrust humanity back into a crisis situation. Take Yellowstone, for example. There's a supervolcano sitting under Yellowstone National Park in the United States. If it erupted at even a fraction of Toba's scale, it would be catastrophic. Global agriculture would collapse. Billions of people would face famine. The modern world as we know it would grind to a halt. Climate change presents another massive threat, and this time it's caused by human hands. We're melting the ice caps, raising sea levels, driving more extreme weather patterns, heat waves, hurricanes, droughts, floods, all getting worse. Climate change could become a human-made Toba disaster. Slower, sure, but potentially just as destructive in the long run. The changing climate doesn't just affect weather, it disrupts food production, it forces mass migrations of people, it creates resource conflicts, it spreads diseases into new areas. All of these ripple effects compound on each other, creating a cascading crisis that's hard to predict and even harder to stop once it gets going. Beyond climate change, humanity also faces the very real threat of nuclear war. We've built enough nuclear weapons to destroy ourselves many times over. A full-scale nuclear conflict wouldn't just kill hundreds of millions of people directly. It would also unleash what scientists call a nuclear winter. Radioactive dust and smoke would spread into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight just like Toba's ash did. Temperatures would plummet, crops would fail worldwide. Even areas far from any nuclear strikes would face starvation. The nuclear winter scenario is basically the Toba scenario, but triggered by human stupidity instead of natural forces. Global pandemics represent yet another existential threat. We've seen what COVID-19 did to the world, and that was a relatively mild pandemic in the grand scheme of things. Imagine a virus with a much higher fatality rate that spreads just as easily. In today's interconnected world, with airplanes flying everywhere and global trade networks, a truly deadly novel virus could spread faster than anything in human history. We're way more connected now than humans were 70,000 years ago, which means diseases can spread globally in days instead of years. That connectivity is great for trade and communication, but it's terrible when it comes to stopping pandemics. One infected person gets on an airplane and suddenly the disease is on multiple continents. And finally, we have dangers from outer space that are always looming. Asteroids, the same kind of asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. We know they're out there. We know they occasionally hit Earth. We just don't know when the next big one will come or if we'll be able to stop it. The difference between now and 70,000 years ago comes down to knowledge and technology. Our Homo sapiens ancestors survived through cooperation and adaptation alone. They had no scientific understanding of what was happening, no technology to help them, just their wits, their tools, and their ability to work together. We have knowledge and technology on our side now. We understand how supervolcanoes work. We can track asteroids and maybe even deflect them. We can develop vaccines for new diseases. We have the theoretical ability to address climate change if we choose to. Technology gives us options our ancestors never had. But here's the problem. Technology is a double-edged sword. It's both a shield that protects us and a potential cause of our own destruction. Nuclear weapons are technology. The industrial processes driving climate change are technology. Biological weapons that could trigger pandemics are technology. Artificial intelligence that might spiral out of our control is technology. Will Homo sapiens use technology wisely to overcome the threats we face, or will we use it to bring about our own downfall? That question remains unanswered. The jury is still out, but one thing seems certain. Just as it was 74,000 years ago, the fate of humanity still depends on our unity, our intelligence, and our adaptability. The genetic bottleneck taught us something crucial about who we are as a species. It revealed that we're all far more closely related than we might think. The racial differences we sometimes focus on, skin color, facial features, those are incredibly superficial from a genetic standpoint. We're all descended from that same small group of survivors. We're all family in a very real biological sense. This unity at the genetic level should remind us that we're in this together. When humanity faces existential threats, we can't afford to be divided. We need the same kind of cooperation that allowed our ancestors to survive the volcanic winter, the same willingness to work together, share knowledge, and help each other out. But achieving that cooperation on a global scale in the modern world is way harder than it was for small bands of hunter-gatherers. We have different nations with different interests, different political systems, different religions and cultures, different economic systems competing with each other. Aligning all of that toward common survival is incredibly challenging. The genetic bottleneck also showed us something about human resilience. We can take an unbelievable beating and still come back. From just 2,000 to 10,000 individuals scattered along coastlines, we rebuilt our entire species. We recovered from the brink of extinction. We expanded across the globe. We developed agriculture, built civilizations, created art and science, and everything else that makes us human. That resilience is still in us. It's part of our DNA now, literally. We evolved to be survivors, to adapt, to overcome obstacles. When things get tough, humans have this tendency to innovate and find solutions. That's our superpower as a species. But resilience has limits. There's only so much punishment a species can take before it breaks. The dinosaurs were around for hundreds of millions of years, way longer than humans have existed, and one asteroid ended them. Being resilient doesn't make you invincible. We also need to think about what kind of bottleneck we might face in the future. 70,000 years ago, the bottleneck was geographically scattered. Small groups of humans survived in different locations around Africa and Asia. This meant genetic and cultural diversity was preserved to some extent, even though the overall population crashed. A future bottleneck might not be so kind. If a global nuclear war or pandemic struck, it could hit everywhere at once. The survivors might be concentrated in just a few locations, which would mean even less genetic diversity than before. Or worse, the bottleneck could be so severe that we don't recover at all. Modern technology creates a weird situation. On one hand, we're better equipped to survive disasters than our ancestors were. We have stored food, underground shelters, medical knowledge, communication systems. Some percentage of humanity would probably survive even a worst-case scenario. On the other hand, we're also more dependent on complex systems than ever before. Our ancestors could survive with nothing but stone tools and fire. Could you survive if the electrical grid went down permanently? If supply chains collapsed? If modern agriculture stopped working? Most of us couldn't. We've traded resilience for comfort and efficiency. The scientists studying the genetic bottleneck have given us a gift. They've shown us what humanity looked like at its most vulnerable point. They've proven that we came incredibly close to not making it, and they've demonstrated that the difference between survival and extinction can come down to small margins. Those small margins matter. The groups that made it through the bottleneck weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who happened to be in the right locations, near the coast where food was available, in areas where the climate didn't get quite as bad. Sometimes survival comes down to luck and being in the right place at the right time. But luck only takes you so far. The groups that survived also had to make smart decisions. They chose to cooperate instead of fighting each other over scarce resources. They chose to innovate and find new food sources instead of giving up. They chose to care for the sick and elderly instead of abandoning them. These choices mattered. Today we face similar choices. When resources become scarce, do we cooperate or compete? Do we work together to solve problems or retreat into tribal groups? Do we invest in technologies that benefit everyone or just the wealthy and powerful? Do we care for the vulnerable or leave them behind? The choices we make now will determine whether we survive the next crisis. The genetic bottleneck story also raises uncomfortable questions about inequality. During the volcanic winter, not all humans had equal chances of survival. The groups living near abundant coastal resources had huge advantages over groups stuck inland where everything was dying. Geography mattered. Access to resources mattered. In a future crisis, those same dynamics will play out again, but probably worse. Wealthy nations with advanced technology and resources will fare better than poor nations. People with money will have access to supplies, medicine, and safety that others won't. The bottleneck won't affect everyone equally. It never does. This creates a moral dilemma. If we know that survival will be unequally distributed, what's our responsibility to each other? Do wealthy nations have an obligation to help poorer ones prepare for disasters? Do individuals with resources have a duty to help those without? How we answer these questions might determine not just who survives, but what kind of species we become. Our ancestors didn't have to grapple with these ethical questions on a global scale because they lived in small groups where everyone knew each other. You helped your group survive because they were your family, your friends, the people you saw every day. Scaling that up to 8 billion strangers scattered across the planet is a completely different challenge. The genetic bottleneck reveals something both humbling and inspiring. It shows us that we're not invincible. Nature can absolutely destroy us if we're not careful, but it also shows us that we have incredible survival instincts and abilities when pushed to the edge. The question is whether we'll tap into those abilities before it's too late or wait until we're already in crisis mode. Think about what the genetic bottleneck means for how we understand human nature itself. For a long time, people have debated whether humans are naturally cooperative or naturally competitive, naturally good or naturally selfish. The bottleneck period gives us some clues about this question. The groups that survived had to cooperate intensely. There's no way around it. A lone individual, no matter how smart or strong, couldn't have made it through years of volcanic winter alone. You needed other people to help hunt, gather, keep fires going, watch for predators, care for children, share knowledge. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was survival. This suggests that cooperation is deeply wired into us as a species. The Homo sapiens who made it through the bottleneck and became our ancestors were the cooperative ones. The groups that fell apart due to internal conflict didn't survive to pass on their genes. Natural selection favored cooperation during that crisis. It literally shaped who we are today. But cooperation during a crisis doesn't necessarily mean cooperation during good times. When resources are abundant, humans definitely compete with each other. We form hierarchies, we fight over status, territory, mates, resources. Competition is also part of our nature. The question is which tendency wins out when things get difficult. The bottleneck suggests that when facing existential threats, our cooperative side takes over, or at least it should. The groups that survived made cooperation work even under the worst possible circumstances. They found ways to share limited resources fairly enough that the group stayed together. They created social bonds strong enough to endure years of hardship. How did they do this? Part of it was probably small group size. When you're in a band of 20 to 50 people, everyone knows everyone else. You can't hide. You can't cheat without being caught. Social pressure keeps people in line. You cooperate because your reputation depends on it, and because you'll see these same people tomorrow and the day after. Scaling cooperation up to larger groups is way harder. Once groups get bigger than about 150 people, which is called Dunbar's number, we start to lose those tight social bonds. We can't keep track of everyone's reputation. Cheaters can hide more easily. Social cohesion starts breaking down unless you have other mechanisms to maintain it. This is why creating cooperation at the scale of modern nations or the entire global population is so difficult. We didn't evolve to cooperate with millions or billions of strangers. Our brains are wired for small group cooperation. Getting those same cooperative instincts to work at massive scales requires artificial constructs like laws, governments, institutions, shared beliefs. The genetic bottleneck also tells us something about the role of culture in human survival. Culture, meaning shared knowledge, traditions, stories, and practices, becomes incredibly important when populations are small and vulnerable. You can't afford to lose knowledge because there aren't enough people to recreate it if it's forgotten. Imagine you're in one of those small survivor groups clinging to life along a coastline. Someone in your group knows how to make really effective fish hooks from bone. That person dies. If they didn't teach anyone else that skill before dying, the knowledge is lost forever. Your group just became a little less capable of surviving. This creates huge pressure to pass down knowledge reliably. Teaching becomes crucial. Storytelling becomes crucial. Rituals and traditions that encode important information become crucial. Culture isn't just decoration, it's survival technology. Language plays a massive role here too. The more effectively you can communicate complex ideas, the better you can pass down knowledge across generations. Groups with more sophisticated language abilities could teach their children better. They could coordinate more complex activities. They could plan further into the future. This might explain why Homo sapiens, with our advanced language abilities, survived while other human species didn't. Neanderthals were strong, they had big brains, they used tools, but maybe their language wasn't quite as developed as ours. Maybe they couldn't transmit culture as effectively across generations. That small difference could have been the deciding factor. The bottleneck period probably also accelerated human cultural evolution. When populations are small and under intense pressure, beneficial cultural innovations spread quickly. If someone figures out a better way to hunt fish, everyone in the group learns it immediately because everyone's survival depends on it. There's no resistance to change when change means the difference between eating and starving. In larger, more stable populations, cultural change happens slower. People are comfortable with how things are. They resist new ideas. There's less pressure to innovate. But during the bottleneck, innovation was constant and necessary. The groups that adapted their culture and practices most quickly to changing conditions were the ones most likely to survive. This creates an interesting thought. Maybe humanity's capacity for rapid cultural change, our ability to completely transform our way of life within just a few generations, is actually a legacy of the bottleneck period. We evolved to be culturally flexible because our ancestors who weren't flexible died out. Modern humans can adapt to almost any environment or situation by changing our culture and technology. We live in deserts, Arctic regions, tropical rainforests, high mountains, you name it. No other species comes close to our environmental range, and we achieve this not through biological adaptation, which takes thousands of generations, but through cultural adaptation, which can happen in just a few years or decades. The genetic bottleneck forces us to confront something uncomfortable about human uniqueness. We like to think we survived and thrived because we're somehow special or superior, because we're smarter than other species, because we deserve to be the dominant life form on Earth. But the bottleneck shows that survival often comes down to luck and circumstances, not inherent superiority. Homo sapiens survived partly because some groups happened to be in the right places when disaster struck, near coastlines where food remained available, in regions where the climate impacts were slightly less severe. If those coastal refugees hadn't existed, we might not have made it regardless of how smart we were. Other human species might have been just as intelligent and capable as Homo sapiens. Neanderthals probably were, but they lived in regions that got hit harder by the volcanic winter. They depended more on large game animals that went extinct. They didn't have the same access to coastal resources. Geography and luck played enormous roles in who survived. This should make us more humble about our place in nature. We're not invincible. We're not guaranteed to survive just because we're smart. We got lucky, and luck can run out. The next major crisis might not leave any convenient refuges where we can hide and wait it out. The bottleneck also raises questions about human diversity and how we should value it. When the population dropped to just a few thousand people, humanity lost a lot of genetic diversity. Rare genes disappeared, unique traits vanished. The genetic richness that comes from having hundreds of thousands of individuals all slightly different from each other got squeezed down to a much narrower range. We can see the effects of this loss even today in our relatively low genetic diversity compared to other species, but what we can't see is what we lost. What unique human traits or abilities existed before the bottleneck that no longer exist now? What potential futures for humanity disappeared when those genes were lost? This has implications for how we think about human diversity today. Every human population, every ethnic group, every individual carries unique genetic variants. Some of these might be crucial for surviving future challenges we can't even anticipate yet. Losing diversity now could make us more vulnerable later. But we're losing diversity in multiple ways. Small, isolated populations are disappearing as modern life homogenizes the world. Languages are going extinct, taking unique cultural knowledge with them. Traditional practices and knowledge systems are being abandoned and forgotten. We're creating a voluntary bottleneck of diversity, even without a natural disaster forcing it on us. The groups that survived the original bottleneck maintained just enough diversity to bounce back. If the bottleneck had been slightly more severe, if a few more groups had been wiped out, humanity might have been stuck with insufficient genetic and cultural diversity to adapt to changing conditions. There's a minimum viable population below which recovery becomes impossible. For most species, that minimum viable population is pretty high. A few thousand individuals isn't enough for long-term survival. Inbreeding becomes a problem. Genetic diseases spread. There's not enough diversity to adapt to new challenges. Homo sapiens barely squeaked above this threshold. We got lucky that a few thousand was just barely enough. In the modern world, we're unlikely to face a bottleneck that reduces our population to a few thousand people. If we did, it would probably mean something so catastrophic happened that recovery would be almost impossible anyway. The more realistic threat is a bottleneck that reduces populations to tens or hundreds of millions, which sounds like a lot, but represents losing 90% or more of humanity. A bottleneck of that scale would still be devastating. Losing billions of people means losing vast amounts of knowledge, infrastructure, social institutions, culture. Even if the survivors had high genetic diversity, they'd face the challenge of rebuilding civilization from the rubble. It took our ancestors thousands of years to recover from a bottleneck to a few thousand people. How long would it take to recover from a bottleneck to a few 100 million? The speed of recovery matters a lot. After the Toba eruption, the volcanic winter eventually ended. The climate stabilized. Food sources gradually came back. This gave Homo sapiens time to recover and grow. But what if the crisis doesn't end? What if climate change creates permanent new conditions that are just worse forever? What if we trigger feedback loops that keep getting worse instead of stabilizing? In that scenario, recovery might not be possible. The population might stabilize at a new, much lower level, or it might keep declining until extinction. Our ancestors had the advantage that their crisis was temporary. The supervolcano eventually stopped erupting. The ash eventually settled. The climate eventually recovered. We might not have that advantage if we create our own crisis through climate change or nuclear war. The genetic bottleneck teaches us that human survival is not guaranteed or inevitable. It's contingent on circumstances, many of which are beyond our control. We can't prevent supervolcanoes from erupting. We can't stop asteroids from existing. We probably can't prevent future pandemics entirely. What we can control is how we respond to these threats. Our ancestors responded by cooperating, adapting, innovating, and never giving up even when the situation seemed hopeless. They didn't have the luxury of despair. They had to keep trying because the alternative was extinction. We face the same choice now. Give up and accept whatever happens, or fight like hell to ensure humanity survives. The question is whether modern humans still have that same desperate determination to survive that our ancestors had. We live comfortable lives in developed nations. We're cushioned from most hardships. We've never really faced existential threats on a personal level. When push comes to shove, will we make the hard choices necessary to survive as a species? History suggests we will. Humans are remarkably good at rising to challenges when we finally accept that the threat is real. The problem is we're also remarkably good at denying threats until it's almost too late. We see this with climate change. The science has been clear for decades, but we've dragged our feet on taking action because it's uncomfortable and expensive. The genetic bottleneck shows what happens when you wait too long to respond to a crisis. You end up fighting for survival from a position of extreme weakness instead of preparing in advance from a position of strength. Our ancestors didn't have the option to prepare. The supervolcano erupted without warning. They had to react and adapt on the fly. We have warning. We know about the threats we face. We have time to prepare, though that time is running out. The question is whether we'll use it wisely or waste it arguing and procrastinating until the crisis is already upon us and we're forced to react from weakness like our ancestors were. One fascinating aspect of the genetic bottleneck is how it might have shaped human psychology and behavior in ways we don't fully recognize. Think about some common human traits that seem universal across cultures: the fear of being alone, the need to belong to a group, the anxiety we feel when excluded from social circles. These might all trace back to the bottleneck period. During those desperate years after Toba, being kicked out of your group was essentially a death sentence. You couldn't survive alone. Social rejection wasn't just emotionally painful, it was literally life-threatening. Groups that were good at maintaining cohesion and avoiding fractures were more likely to survive as units. Individuals who were terrified of exile were more likely to behave in ways that kept them in good standing with the group. Natural selection would have strongly favoured both groups that stayed together and individuals who desperately wanted to belong. Over thousands of years, this could have wired deep psychological drives into us. The fear of social rejection that many people feel today, the anxiety about being excluded or ostracised, these might be evolutionary echoes of when exclusion meant death. This also might explain why humans are so tribal by nature. We naturally form in groups and outgroups. We identify with some people and see others as different. During the bottleneck, your group was your survival. Other groups were competition for scarce resources. Being intensely loyal to your group and suspicious of outsiders was adaptive. It kept you alive. The problem is, these same psychological drives cause massive problems in the modern world. We don't need to be tribal anymore. We'd actually be better off cooperating across group boundaries, but we can't easily override instincts that were burned into us over thousands of years of evolution. We're stuck with Stone Age psychology trying to navigate a space-age world. Human storytelling might also have roots in the bottleneck period. Stories are how we pass down information across generations without losing it. During the bottleneck, when populations were tiny and fragile, stories became crucial for survival. A story about which plants are poisonous, a story about where to find water during droughts, a story about successful hunting techniques. These weren't entertainment, they were survival manuals. Groups that were good at creating and preserving stories had a massive advantage. They could pass down accumulated knowledge efficiently. Each generation didn't have to relearn everything from scratch. This meant storytelling ability became strongly selected for. Humans who were good at telling engaging, memorable stories were more valuable to their groups. Their knowledge got preserved and passed on. This might explain why humans are obsessed with stories. We tell them constantly. We consume them through books, movies, TV, video games. We frame our own lives as narratives. We can't seem to help it. Storytelling might be such a deep part of human nature because it was literally a survival skill for our ancestors during the bottleneck. The archaeological evidence from this period tells its own story. The sites that have been excavated from around 70,000 years ago show fascinating patterns. You see innovation happening, new types of tools appearing, better techniques for working stone and bone. Evidence of symbolic thinking like jewellery made from shells and ochre used for body decoration or cave painting. This suggests that the bottleneck period, despite being a time of crisis, was also a time of rapid cultural development. Necessity drove innovation. Groups had to get creative to survive. They experimented with new approaches. They took risks trying things that hadn't been tried before because the old ways weren't working anymore. Blombos Cave in South Africa provides some of the most interesting evidence. Archaeological layers from this period show humans using ochre, creating shell beads for decoration, making sophisticated bone tools, and possibly engaging in symbolic art. These aren't just survival activities, these are expressions of abstract thought and culture. Why would humans facing starvation and desperate conditions spend time and energy on art and decoration? It seems wasteful at first glance, but it actually makes sense. Art and symbolism strengthen social bonds. They create shared identity. They communicate ideas that are hard to express otherwise. They mark important events and transitions. During a crisis, strong social bonds meant survival. Art and ritual that reinforced those bonds weren't luxuries, they were necessities. A group that had strong cultural identity and cohesion was more likely to stick together through hardship. The emotional and psychological benefits of art and symbolism had very real survival value. The sites along ancient coastlines are particularly revealing. Pinnacle Point in South Africa shows intensive use of marine resources during the bottleneck period. Shells from various sea creatures, evidence of systematic shellfish gathering, tools adapted for coastal life. These sites were refuges where humans held on while the rest of the world was in crisis. What's interesting is the diversity of these coastal sites. Humans weren't just surviving, they were developing distinct regional cultures adapted to local conditions. Groups along the South African coast developed different toolkits and strategies than groups along the Indian Ocean coast. Even during the bottleneck, when populations were tiny, human culture was already diversifying. This diversity might have been crucial for long-term survival. Different groups tried different strategies. Most strategies probably failed, but some worked. Having multiple groups trying multiple approaches increased the odds that at least some groups would hit on successful adaptations. It was like having multiple backup plans running simultaneously. The genetic evidence complements the archaeological evidence in interesting ways. DNA studies show that the bottleneck didn't affect all populations equally. Some groups went through more severe bottlenecks than others. Some regions maintained higher populations than others. This uneven impact created the patterns of genetic diversity we see today. For example, African populations have higher genetic diversity than non-African populations. This makes sense. Africa is where Homo sapiens originated. African populations had longer to build up diversity. Plus, some African groups might have been less affected by the Toba eruption since they were farther from the eruption site. Non-African populations, descended from the groups that left Africa, have lower genetic diversity. They went through a founder effect bottleneck when small groups migrated out of Africa, then possibly another bottleneck during the Toba crisis. Two bottlenecks in relatively quick succession would severely reduce genetic diversity. This genetic structure has implications we're still figuring out. Medical research shows that disease susceptibilities vary between populations partly because of these ancient bottlenecks. Some genetic diseases are more common in certain populations because the mutations happen to be present in the small founding groups that survived and expanded. Understanding these patterns helps us develop better medical treatments. It shows why some drugs work better for some populations than others. It reveals why certain genetic conditions cluster in specific regions. The ancient bottleneck still affects human health today in measurable ways. Another aspect worth considering is how the bottleneck might have affected human intelligence. There's a theory, though it's controversial, that the extreme selective pressure of the bottleneck might have rapidly increased average human intelligence. Only the smartest, most creative, most adaptable individuals and groups survived. This would have quickly shifted the average intelligence of the entire species upward. We don't have direct evidence for this. We can't measure the intelligence of ancient humans, but we do see evidence of accelerating cultural complexity right around the time of the bottleneck. More sophisticated tools, more complex social behaviors, more symbolic thinking. Something was changing in human cognition during this period. It's also possible that the bottleneck period saw the rise of full modern language. Some linguists think that fully developed, grammatically complex language might have emerged relatively recently in human evolution, maybe around this time. Language would have been absolutely crucial for the kind of cooperation and knowledge transmission necessary to survive the bottleneck. If language did develop or become more sophisticated during this period, it would explain a lot. It would explain the rapid cultural innovation, the complex social structures, the ability to plan and coordinate long-term strategies. Language is what really sets Homo sapiens apart from other species, including other human species that existed at the same time. Neanderthals probably had some form of language, but maybe not as complex as ours. That subtle difference in communication ability might have made all the difference during the crisis. Homo sapiens could coordinate better, share knowledge more effectively, plan more complex strategies. These small advantages compounded over time into decisive survival advantages. The moral and philosophical implications of the bottleneck are worth thinking about too. If all humans alive today are descended from just a few thousand survivors, we're all related much more closely than we might want to admit. The concept of race, which has caused so much conflict and suffering throughout history, becomes even more obviously arbitrary and meaningless. From a genetic standpoint, humans are remarkably homogeneous. The visible differences we fixate on, skin color, facial features, hair texture, these are superficial variations that developed over just the last few tens of thousands of years. Underneath, we're all almost identical. We're all cousins descending from the same small band of survivors. This scientific reality directly contradicts a lot of racist ideologies that claim fundamental differences between human groups. There are no fundamental differences. There's one human species with minor variations. The bottleneck proved this by forcing our ancestors through the same narrow gate regardless of what they looked like or where they lived. Religious and philosophical traditions have long talked about the unity of humanity, the brotherhood of man, the idea that we're all related. The genetic bottleneck gives us scientific confirmation of these traditional beliefs. We literally are all family. The person living on the opposite side of the planet from you is your distant cousin. You share recent common ancestors. This should change how we think about human conflicts and divisions. Fighting other humans is like fighting your own family, which, to be fair, families do fight, but there's still a recognition that underneath the conflicts there's a fundamental bond. We're stuck with each other, we came from the same place, we survived the same crisis, we're in this together whether we like it or not. The bottleneck also raises questions about determinism versus free will in human history. Was the bottleneck inevitable? Did it have to happen? Or could history have gone differently? If the Toba eruption had been slightly smaller or happened at a different time, would Homo sapiens have avoided the bottleneck entirely? Would we be more genetically diverse today? Would our species have developed differently? We can't know the answers to these counterfactual questions. History only happened one way, but it's worth recognizing that small changes in timing or circumstances could have led to radically different outcomes. Our existence might be contingent on a series of lucky breaks that could easily have gone the other way. This contingency should make us less arrogant about humanity's place in the universe. We're not the inevitable culmination of evolution. We're not destiny's chosen species. We're the lucky survivors of a planetary disaster that easily could have gone worse. We're here partly because of our adaptability and intelligence, yes, but also partly because of random chance. Looking at the archaeological sites from the bottleneck period, you can almost feel the desperation of those ancient humans, small bands clinging to existence in coastal refuges, making do with whatever resources they could find, innovating out of necessity, every day a struggle to survive, every night uncertain whether morning would come. And yet they persevered. They didn't give up. They kept trying new approaches when old ones failed. They cooperated even when cooperation was hard. They maintained their culture and passed down knowledge even in the darkest times. That persistence, that refusal to surrender, is what ultimately saved the human species. We carry the legacy of that persistence inside us. Every human alive today inherited the genes and, in a sense, the spirit of those survivors. When we face overwhelming challenges, when things seem hopeless, we have the same capacity to endure that they had. The question is whether we'll tap into it, or whether we've grown too soft and comfortable to access that ancient resilience. Modern life in developed countries has become incredibly safe and comfortable compared to what our ancestors experienced. We don't face starvation, we don't fear predators, we have medicine for diseases, we have shelters that protect us from weather, we've insulated ourselves from most of the harsh realities of nature that shaped human evolution. This comfort is wonderful in many ways. Nobody wants to go back to living in caves and fighting for survival every day, but there's a downside. We might be losing touch with the hardiness and adaptability that got us through the bottleneck. We've become dependent on complex systems that we don't fully understand and can't easily repair if they break. Your ancient ancestor could survive with a sharp rock, some fire, and knowledge of local plants and animals. Could you? Most modern humans would die pretty quickly if dropped into a wilderness with no tools or supplies. We've traded individual resilience for collective capability. As long as civilization keeps running, we're fine, but if it stops, we're in serious trouble. The bottleneck period showed that knowledge preservation becomes absolutely critical during crises. When populations are small, losing knowledge is easy. One person dies without passing on their skills, and those skills are gone forever. This is why traditional cultures put so much emphasis on oral transmission of knowledge, on teaching the young, on rituals that encode important information. Modern society has outsourced a lot of knowledge preservation to books, computers, and the internet. This works great under normal conditions. We have access to more information than any humans in history, but this system is fragile. If the electrical grid fails permanently, if computers stop working, if the internet goes down, a huge amount of that knowledge becomes inaccessible. Books and libraries help, but they're also vulnerable. They can burn, they can be destroyed, they require maintained buildings and climate control to preserve them long term. Ancient oral traditions were more robust in some ways. As long as people survived, the knowledge survived in their memories and stories. We might want to think about creating backup systems for preserving crucial knowledge, not just storing it digitally, but ensuring it gets transmitted to actual human minds, making sure enough people understand essential skills and information that it won't be lost if our technological systems fail. This is basically what our ancestors did during the bottleneck, but we need to do it at a much larger scale. The bottleneck also highlights the importance of maintaining diversity, not just genetic diversity, but diversity of knowledge, skills, cultures, and approaches to problems. During the bottleneck, different groups tried different survival strategies. Most groups probably failed, but some succeeded. That diversity of approaches meant at least some humans survived. Today, we're moving toward a more homogeneous global culture. Everyone watches the same movies, uses the same technology, follows similar lifestyles. In many ways, this is fine, but it also means we're losing diverse traditional knowledge systems that might contain useful information we've forgotten or never knew. Indigenous cultures around the world have accumulated thousands of years of knowledge about local ecosystems, medicinal plants, sustainable practices, survival skills. As these cultures disappear or get absorbed into mainstream global culture, that knowledge gets lost. We're essentially running a reverse bottleneck on cultural diversity, narrowing it down voluntarily. This seems short-sighted. We don't know what challenges we'll face in the future. We don't know what knowledge will turn out to be crucial. Preserving diversity of knowledge and approaches gives us more options when things go wrong. It's like maintaining biodiversity in ecosystems. You never know which species will turn out to be essential. The genetic bottleneck teaches us about the value of redundancy and backup systems. Our ancestors survived partly because they were scattered across multiple refuge locations. If all humans had been concentrated in one area that got hit hard by the volcanic winter, we might not have made it. Geographic distribution saved us. Today, we're doing the opposite in some ways. We're concentrating more and more humans in massive cities. We're creating single points of failure in our infrastructure and supply chains. We're optimizing for efficiency at the cost of resilience. This makes us vulnerable to disruptions that affect large areas or critical systems. A truly resilient civilization would maintain redundancy, multiple food production systems, distributed energy generation, backup knowledge preservation, communities that could survive somewhat independently if larger systems failed. We're moving away from this model in pursuit of efficiency and economies of scale. The bottleneck period also demonstrates the critical importance of maintaining genetic diversity in populations. The founder effect that occurred when small groups left Africa reduced genetic diversity in non-African populations. This has had lasting consequences in terms of disease susceptibility and other health factors. We should be conscious of avoiding further genetic bottlenecks, even small ones. Space colonization, for example, will likely involve sending small founding populations to other planets or habitats. These founding populations need to have sufficient genetic diversity, or the colonies will face health problems down the line. We need to learn from the bottleneck and plan accordingly. There's also a question about artificial selection and genetic engineering. As we develop the ability to modify human genes, we'll face choices about which traits to select for or against. The bottleneck showed that genetic diversity, including variations that might seem disadvantageous in current conditions, can be valuable for future adaptability. We should be cautious about narrowing our gene pool through artificial means. The archaeological evidence shows that innovation accelerated during and after the bottleneck period. Humans started developing more sophisticated tools, creating art, engaging in trade over longer distances, building more complex social structures. Crisis drove innovation. Necessity was the mother of invention. This pattern shows up repeatedly in human history. Wars, despite being terrible, often accelerate technological development. Disasters lead to new approaches and innovations. Challenges force us to think creatively and try new things. Comfort and stability, while pleasant, can lead to stagnation. This creates a dilemma for modern civilization. We want stability and comfort. We should want these things, but we also need to maintain our capacity for innovation and adaptation. How do we stay sharp without needing actual crises to force us to innovate? How do we preserve the creative problem-solving that helped our ancestors survive without requiring desperate conditions? Some of this comes down to education and culture, teaching people to value creativity and innovation, encouraging experimentation and accepting failure as part of learning, creating challenges and competitions that drive innovation without requiring actual survival stakes. Basically simulating the selective pressure of crises without the actual danger. The bottleneck period revealed which human traits were most essential for survival. Intelligence, clearly, cooperation and social skills, physical hardiness and endurance, creativity and adaptability, emotional resilience, these are the traits that got us through. These are what natural selection was selecting for during those desperate years. Modern society doesn't select for quite the same traits. Success today depends more on things like specialized skills, ability to navigate bureaucracy, financial savvy, technological literacy. These are useful traits for modern life, but would they help you survive a collapse of civilization? Maybe not. There's an argument for deliberately cultivating the old survival traits, even though we don't need them day to day. Physical fitness and wilderness skills, practical knowledge about food, water and shelter, social skills for building and maintaining communities, emotional resilience, and ability to endure hardship. These might seem obsolete, but they're what saved our ancestors. The bottleneck story also contains lessons about hope and despair. The situation 74,000 years ago looked hopeless. Volcanic winter, starvation, mass death, most human groups getting wiped out. By any rational assessment, Homo sapiens should have gone extinct. The odds were overwhelmingly against survival. But some people refused to give up. They kept trying even when it seemed pointless. They adapted and innovated and cooperated and held on by their fingernails until conditions improved. That stubborn refusal to accept extinction saved the species. Hope, or maybe just pure stubbornness, turned out to be a survival trait. Today, when people look at challenges like climate change or nuclear weapons or pandemics, it's easy to fall into despair. The problems seem overwhelming. The solutions seem impossible. Why bother trying if we're doomed anyway? This kind of thinking is understandable, but it's also exactly wrong. The bottleneck shows that situations that look hopeless aren't necessarily hopeless. Humans have survived worse. We've come back from the literal brink of extinction. Giving up guarantees failure. Trying at least gives you a chance. Our ancestors didn't know they would survive. They just refused to stop trying. That's the attitude that saved humanity. This doesn't mean naive optimism. The bottleneck period was genuinely terrible. Countless humans died. Entire groups were wiped out. The survivors endured unimaginable hardship. Acknowledging the severity of threats is important, but acknowledgement should lead to action, not paralysis. Our ancestors faced their crisis head-on. We need to do the same. The genetic studies of the bottleneck have also revealed interesting patterns about human migration and expansion after the crisis ended. As conditions improved and populations recovered, Homo sapiens began expanding out of the refuge areas. Different groups moved in different directions, eventually populating the entire planet. This expansion wasn't random. Groups followed coastlines and river valleys. They moved into areas where resources were available. They adapted to new environments as they encountered them. Each migration created new founding populations that developed into distinct regional groups over time. The peopling of the Americas, for example, came relatively late. Groups crossed from Asia into North America sometime around 15 to 20,000 years ago, when sea levels were lower and land bridges existed. These founding populations eventually spread throughout North and South America, adapting to every climate zone from Arctic to tropical. Australia was populated even earlier, probably around 50 to 60,000 years ago. Groups had to cross significant water gaps to reach Australia, which suggests they had developed boat technology. Once there, they adapted to Australia's unique environment and developed distinct cultures. Europe was populated by multiple waves of migration from Africa and the Middle East. Groups moved in, adapted to Ice Age conditions, developed new hunting strategies for large game like mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. The interaction between different waves of migrants and indigenous populations created complex genetic and cultural patterns. Each of these expansions involved small founding populations that went through their own minor bottlenecks. The founder effect happened repeatedly as small groups split off and moved into new territories. This layering of bottlenecks on top of the original Toba bottleneck shaped the genetic structure of modern human populations. Understanding these patterns helps us trace human history and migration routes. It shows how humans spread across the globe. It explains why certain genetic markers appear in some populations but not others. It's like reading the story of human expansion written in our DNA. The bottleneck period fundamentally shaped what it means to be human. Our psychology, our social structures, our capacity for language and culture, our genetic makeup, all bear the imprint of that crisis. We are quite literally descendants of survivors. The traits that got them through are the traits we inherited. This gives us both advantages and disadvantages in the modern world. The cooperation and social bonding that saved our ancestors also make us vulnerable to tribalism and conflict between groups. The adaptability and creativity that allowed survival also make us restless and dissatisfied with stability. The drive to survive at all costs also makes us capable of terrible things when threatened. We're working with hardware and software, both genetic and cultural, that was optimized for surviving the bottleneck. The world has changed dramatically since then. We've created civilization, technology, complex societies that our ancestors never imagined. But underneath, we're still running on that ancient programming. Recognizing this mismatch between our evolved traits and our modern environment is crucial for understanding both our problems and our potential solutions. We can't just wish away our evolutionary heritage. We need to work with it, design our societies and institutions in ways that align with human nature rather than fighting against it. The bottleneck period also revealed something profound about human potential. Under extreme pressure, humans are capable of remarkable things. Innovation, cooperation, endurance, creativity. These capacities exist within us waiting to be activated. Most of the time, we cruise along using a fraction of our capabilities, but when pushed, we can access reserves of strength and ingenuity we didn't know we had. This should give us confidence facing future challenges. The same species that survived the volcanic winter can survive whatever's coming next. We have the tools, we have the capacity. The question is whether we'll mobilize those capacities before the crisis hits, or wait until we're forced to react. Proactive preparation is always better than reactive scrambling. Our ancestors didn't have the luxury of preparing for the Toba eruption. It hit them without warning, but we can see our threats coming. Climate change is happening in slow motion. We can watch it unfold. Nuclear weapons exist, and we know they're dangerous. Pandemic risks are well documented. Asteroid trajectories can be calculated years in advance. We have the opportunity to prepare, to build resilience, to develop solutions before we desperately need them. This is an enormous advantage our ancestors didn't have. Using this advantage wisely could be the difference between surviving the next crisis easily or barely, scraping through by the skin of our teeth like we did 74,000 years ago. The choice we face is similar to the choice our ancestors faced, but on a larger scale. Cooperate or compete, innovate or stagnate, adapt or die, share resources or fight over them, think long-term or grab short-term benefits. The stakes are just as high, potentially higher actually, since we have the capacity to destroy ourselves completely through nuclear war or catastrophic climate change. Our ancestors didn't have to worry about self-inflicted extinction. All their threats were natural. We've added a new category of threats that come from our own actions. This makes our situation more complex, but also means we have more control. Natural disasters just happen. But human-caused problems can theoretically be prevented or fixed if we choose to do so. The big question is whether we'll make those choices, whether we'll overcome short-term thinking and political divisions to address long-term existential risks, whether we'll invest in solutions even though they're expensive and difficult, whether we'll cooperate globally even though it's hard and requires trusting people we don't know. The bottleneck period showed that cooperation works, that it's possible even under the worst conditions, that humans are capable of putting aside differences and working together when survival demands it. We've done it before. We can do it again. We just need to recognize that survival demands it now, before the crisis becomes undeniable. There's a lesson here about timing. Our ancestors had to cooperate reactively after the disaster struck. Many groups probably failed to cooperate effectively and died out. The groups that survived were the ones that figured out cooperation quickly. We have the chance to cooperate proactively before disaster strikes. This should be easier, but somehow it isn't. Human psychology makes distant threats feel less urgent than immediate ones. Climate change is a perfect example. The threat is real and serious. The science is clear, but it feels distant and abstract to many people. Future generations will suffer, sure, but that's not as motivating as immediate personal danger. This psychological bias toward present concerns over future ones probably made sense during the bottleneck when immediate survival was all that mattered, but it's counterproductive now. We need to somehow hack our own psychology, make future threats feel more immediate and real, create urgency around long-term problems, mobilize the same crisis response that kicked in during the bottleneck, but do it proactively before the crisis fully arrives. This is hard. It goes against our instincts, but it's necessary. The story of the genetic bottleneck has spread widely through popular science and media. Many people have heard about it in some form, but there's a risk that the story becomes just another interesting fact rather than a lesson that changes behavior. Oh, cool. Humans almost went extinct once. Anyway, back to whatever I was doing. The real value of understanding the bottleneck is using that understanding to inform our choices now, looking at what worked for our ancestors and applying those lessons, recognizing our vulnerabilities and addressing them, appreciating how fragile human survival can be and acting accordingly. Education plays a role here, teaching people not just the facts about the bottleneck, but the implications, connecting ancient history to modern challenges, showing how the same traits that saved us then need to be cultivated now, making the lessons personal and relevant rather than just academic. The bottleneck story also provides a powerful counter-narrative to various forms of bigotry and tribalism. When you understand that all humans are recently descended from a tiny group of survivors, that we're all essentially the same at the genetic level, that our differences are superficial and recent, it becomes harder to maintain prejudices based on race or ethnicity. This doesn't mean prejudice disappears. People are remarkably good at maintaining beliefs even in the face of contradictory evidence, but at least the scientific reality is clear. We're one species, one family, one group of survivors descended from those who made it through the bottleneck. This fundamental unity should inform how we treat each other. The expansion after the bottleneck shows another important pattern. Successful expansion required both cooperation within groups and peaceful coexistence between groups. Groups that wasted resources fighting each other did worse than groups that traded and shared knowledge. Competition between groups happened, sure, but pure competition without any cooperation would have been counterproductive. Modern nations face the same dynamics. Pure competition between nations wastes resources and increases risks of conflict, but cooperation requires trust and shared goals. Finding the balance between healthy competition that drives innovation and necessary cooperation that addresses shared challenges is one of the central problems of international relations. The bottleneck period was, in a sense, a great equalizer. It didn't matter what advantages you had before. Everyone faced the same crisis. The groups that survived weren't necessarily the ones who had been most successful before. They were the ones who adapted best to the new conditions. Previous winners became losers. Marginal groups became survivors. This pattern shows up repeatedly in evolution and history. Success in one set of conditions doesn't guarantee success when conditions change. The traits that made you dominant can become liabilities. The groups thriving today might not be the ones thriving after the next major disruption. Adaptability matters more than current success. This should make successful nations and groups humble. Success is contingent and temporary. Conditions will change. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. Maintaining adaptability and resilience matters more than optimizing for current conditions. The groups that survived the bottleneck weren't the strongest or richest beforehand. They were the most adaptable. Looking toward the future, we need to think about what kind of bottlenecks we might face and how to either prevent them or prepare to survive them. Climate change could create a slow-motion bottleneck, not a sudden crash, but a gradual degradation of conditions that makes supporting large populations increasingly difficult. Food production declines, coastal cities flood, fresh water becomes scarce, regions become uninhabitable. This kind of slow crisis might be harder to survive than a sudden shock. With a sudden disaster, the crisis is obvious. Everyone recognizes it and responds accordingly. But a gradual decline lets people normalize conditions that are getting worse. Each year is only slightly worse than the last. Adaptation happens incrementally. By the time people realize how bad things have gotten, it might be too late to prevent catastrophic outcomes. We need mechanisms for recognizing slow crises before they become acute. Early warning systems, tipping points identified in advance, plans for action when certain thresholds are crossed. This is challenging because it requires acting on predictions about the future rather than responding to present realities. But it's necessary if we want to avoid being forced into reactive crisis mode. The development of space colonization could eventually provide insurance against Earth-based bottlenecks. If humans establish self-sufficient colonies on other worlds, an Earth-based disaster wouldn't mean extinction. This is basically an extension of the strategy that saved our ancestors. They survived because they were geographically distributed. Groups in refuge areas made it through. But space colonization is still in early stages. We don't have the capability yet to create truly self-sufficient off-world colonies. If a major disaster struck Earth in the next few decades, space wouldn't save us. We need to solve our Earth-based problems while also working on becoming a multi-planetary species as long-term insurance. The bottleneck taught us that culture and knowledge are as important as genetics for survival. You can have great genes, but if you don't know how to find food or make fire or cooperate with others, you'll die anyway. Preserving and transmitting culture became crucial during the bottleneck. It's still crucial now. This means investing in education, in preserving diverse knowledge systems, in maintaining cultural traditions that contain valuable information. It means not letting important skills and knowledge disappear just because they seem obsolete in current conditions. You never know what will turn out to be essential later. The oral traditions that preserved knowledge during the bottleneck have largely been replaced by written and digital storage. This has advantages in terms of capacity and accessibility, but it also creates vulnerabilities. What happens if our digital storage systems fail? What happens if future humans can't read our file formats? What happens if the knowledge we need isn't in the right form or place when crisis hits? Redundancy in knowledge storage matters. Multiple formats, multiple locations, multiple transmission methods. Some knowledge should be in digital form, some in physical books, some in human memories and oral traditions, some encoded in culture and ritual. The more ways knowledge is preserved, the less likely it is to be lost when systems fail. The genetic bottleneck demonstrated that it's possible to come back from the brink. Even when things look hopeless, even when the population has crashed to a few thousand individuals, recovery is possible. This should give us hope. It should remind us that humanity is resilient. We've faced extinction before and survived. We can do it again if necessary. But recovery takes time. It took thousands of years for human populations to fully recover from the bottleneck. Thousands of years of hardship and struggle. If we go through another bottleneck, we shouldn't expect a quick bounce back. The survivors, if there are survivors, will face a long, difficult road to recovery. This makes prevention preferable to recovery. Avoiding the bottleneck entirely is better than surviving it. Using our foresight and technology to prevent crises is better than relying on our adaptability to survive them. We have advantages our ancestors lacked. We should use them. The ultimate lesson of the genetic bottleneck might be this: human survival is not guaranteed. It never has been. It never will be. We exist because our ancestors got lucky and made smart choices during a crisis that could easily have killed them all. We continue to exist only as long as we keep making smart choices and maintain reasonable luck. This reality is uncomfortable. People want certainty. We want to believe that humanity's future is secure, that we'll always be here, that our children and grandchildren will inherit a stable world. But the bottleneck shows that security is an illusion. Existence is precarious. The universe doesn't owe us survival. Accepting this reality, really accepting it in our guts, should change how we behave. It should make us more serious about addressing existential risks, more willing to cooperate across boundaries, more focused on long-term thinking, more committed to preserving knowledge and diversity, more grateful for the survival we have rather than taking it for granted. The few thousand humans who survived the volcanic winter didn't take their survival for granted. Every day they woke up alive was a gift they'd fought for. Every meal was hard won. Every child born was precious because population growth was so fragile. They knew viscerally how close extinction was. We've lost that visceral awareness. Comfortable modern life has made existence feel secure when it isn't. Maybe we need to recover some of that ancient awareness, not through actual suffering, but through education and imagination, understanding what our ancestors went through, recognizing that we face similar threats now, choosing to act with the same urgency and cooperation they showed. The story of how 2,000 humans saved our species from extinction isn't just ancient history. It's a preview of challenges we might face again. It's a demonstration of human capabilities under pressure. It's a reminder of our shared heritage. It's a warning about fragility. It's a source of hope about resilience. It's all of these things at once. Every human alive today carries the genetic legacy of those survivors. We're here because they didn't give up, because they cooperated, because they adapted, because they kept trying even when the odds looked impossible. That same capacity exists in us. The question is whether we'll access it, whether we'll live up to the example our ancestors set, whether we'll prove worthy of the survival they fought so hard to achieve. The fate of humanity still depends on the same factors it did 74,000 years ago. Unity, intelligence, adaptability. These are still our greatest strengths. They're what got us through the bottleneck. They're what will get us through whatever comes next. We just need to remember how to use them.